30 feet below the streets of Manhattan, underneath one of the most expensive pieces of real estate on the entire planet, there were over 15,000 people that nobody was looking for. And when scientists finally ran their DNA, what came back didn't just rewrite history. It blew apart everything we thought we knew about where Black Americans actually came from. This is the story of the Manhattan African Burial Ground, and I promise you, by the time this video is over, you will never look at New York City the same way again. Let's go back to October 1991. A construction crew is breaking ground on a brand new $275 million federal office building at 290 Broadway in Lower Manhattan. Routine job, routine dig. The government had already looked at the site and decided there was nothing special underground. Decades of urban development, concrete pipes, and city layers had surely destroyed anything that might have been buried there centuries ago. That was the assumption. That was what the paperwork said. Nobody double-checked. About 30 feet below the surface of Lower Manhattan, the crew hit something, then another, then another. By the end of that first week, it was clear this was not a routine job anymore. What they had hit were human remains, carefully buried, deliberately arranged, clearly very, very old. It turned out to be the largest and earliest African burial ground ever discovered in the United States. Maps of the era showed that the site had been part of a 6.6-acre cemetery where the bodies of more than 15,000 Black people rested. 15,000 people underneath a construction site in the middle of New York City, a city that had been telling its own history for centuries and somehow left this entire chapter underground. Now, here's the first thing you need to understand. Most people think of slavery as a southern thing, plantations, cotton fields, the Deep South. But there were more enslaved Africans in New York before the American Revolution than in any other city except Charleston, South Carolina. During that period, 1 out of every 5 New Yorkers was enslaved. At one point, 40% of colonial New York's households owned slaves. 40%. This was not some distant regional institution. This was the engine of the city that would go on to become the financial capital of the world. An estimated 95% of Africans in the city from the late 17th through the 18th centuries were enslaved to do the work of building the city. The streets, the buildings, the port, the wall. Yes, that wall. Wall Street got its name from a wall that Dutch colonists had enslaved Africans construct in 1653. The most famous street in global finance is literally named after a wall built by enslaved people who were then buried in a cemetery the city forgot existed. The burial ground was in use from the 1630s to 1795. Free and enslaved Africans were barred from being in church burial grounds, so they were pushed to the edges of the city. In 1697, Trinity Church, located just a few blocks away, banned the burial of Black people in its graveyard, forcing the enslaved to find another place to inter their dead. And that other place, that ground beyond the city walls, beyond the wall the enslaved themselves had built, became what we now know as the African Burial Ground. When the city grew, it grew right over it. Streets were paved, buildings went up. The burial ground was graded over, filled in, forgotten. For nearly 200 years, the city just kept building on top of those 15,000 people as if they had never been there at all. Then a drill hit bone 30 feet down in 1991, and suddenly they were there again. The reaction from the government was, at first, exactly what you would expect. The discovery sparked controversy as the African American public held protests and prayer vigils over the following 2 years in order to stop the federal building project that nearly destroyed the site. The General Services Administration, the federal agency running the construction project, initially wanted to keep building. They treated it as a complication to be managed, a delay to be minimized. 20 bodies were damaged by a backhoe before anyone slowed down enough to realize what was actually in the ground. But the Black community in New York understood immediately what this was. These were their people. These were the ones no one had bothered to write down. Ministers, historians, activists, and ordinary New Yorkers mobilized with a force that reached all the way to Congress. In 1992, President George H.W. Bush signed a law officially stopping the project to excavate the graves at the African Burial Ground. The community had won. And when the question came up of who would conduct the scientific analysis of what had been found, they had a specific, non-negotiable answer: Howard University, a historically Black institution. Black scholars studying Black ancestors in a city that still sometimes acted like those ancestors had never existed. Dr. Michael Blakey, an African-American bone expert, became the project's science director. The massive research project eventually involved over 200 researchers, 30 doctors, and 9 laboratories during a 12-year study. What they produced was one of the most comprehensive analyses of an enslaved population ever attempted in the history of science. And what the bones told them was devastating. They found that nearly half the buried were children under the age of 12. Let that sit for a second. Half of the people in this burial ground were children. children who had been put to work young enough that the evidence of it was written permanently into their skeletons. Female burials showed skull rings, which form only when someone has spent years carrying heavy loads on their head. This was a West African tradition that the enslaved had brought with them and continued in America. 300 years later, the rings were still there in the bone, evidence of a practice, a culture, a way of life that the written record had never bothered to preserve. The men showed repetitive strain injuries in their arms and shoulders that had been broken down from years of heavy manual labor starting at a very young age. Children showed growth disruptions in their bones, the biological mark of periods of severe malnutrition that had interrupted normal development and then been preserved in the skeleton for 3 centuries. These were not statistics. These were people who had names their captors did not bother to keep. People who had languages, knowledge of agriculture, construction, and medicine. People who had built a city and been worn down completely in the building of it. Researchers found 27 people with filed teeth, proving many of them had been born in Africa before being brought to America. The chemistry of their teeth, which records the mineral content of the food and water consumed during childhood, was pointing to origins far from Manhattan. West African chemical signatures appeared in many samples, but some signatures did not fit the standard West African profile at all. They pointed to origins further east, further south, further inland than the documented slave trade routes would have predicted. The bones were already starting to complicate the story before a single strand of DNA had been sequenced. Now, after years of study, the remains were returned to the ground with full honors in 2003. Excavations at the site had revealed the remains of 419 Africans and over 500 individual artifacts. Those 419 were carried through 6 cities in hand-carved Ghanaian mahogany coffins. Thousands of people came out to pay their respects. The site became a national monument, and eventually a visitor center and memorial were opened to the public. Most people assumed at that point that the scientific chapter of the story had closed. It had not closed. It had barely started. Here is where this story goes, somewhere that nobody expected. After the reburial, the physical remains were no longer available for direct study. But Howard's laboratory still had something else, something that had been collected at the time of the original excavation and then quietly preserved for decades without anyone fully realizing what was locked inside it. Soil samples. The soil that had surrounded the bodies in the ground. And locked inside that soil, surviving for more than 300 years, was ancient DNA. Not from the bones themselves, from the soil that had held them. Fatima Jackson is a biologist and anthropologist, a professor at Howard University, and the director of the W. Montague Cobb Research Laboratory, the same laboratory that had overseen the original scientific work on the burial ground. She has spent decades studying the genetic history of African and African American populations. She began working through the ancient DNA extracted from that burial soil, and what she found stopped people cold. Here's the assumption that had been baked into almost every account of the transatlantic slave trade for 300 years. The ships that crossed the Atlantic loaded their human cargo at specific ports along the West African coast. The Senegambia region, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, Congo and Angola. These were the documented loading points. These were the places the records mentioned. And so the assumption followed naturally. If that is where the ships loaded, that is where the people came from. The ancestors of Black Americans were West African. That was the story. That was what everyone had been taught. Fatima Jackson was looking at the mitochondrial DNA. This is the genetic material passed from mother to daughter, completely unchanged across generations. It is a direct biological line through time that cannot be altered by marriage, by migration, or by anything that happens along the way. It is, essentially, the most reliable ancestry line that exists in human genetics. And what she found in that soil was not what the assumption predicted. In her own words, we are finding that the maternal lineages of African Americans come from all over Africa, from East Africa, from West Africa, from Central Africa, the majority for sure from West and Central Africa, but also from Southern Africa, from Eastern Africa, and from North Africa, all of Africa. Think about what that means. The people buried 30 feet below a Manhattan construction site, the people who built the wall that gave Wall Street its name, the people who dug the streets and raised the buildings of a city that would go on to tell its own history without them in it. Those people did not come from one corner of a continent. They came from across an entire continent. Not just from the coasts the slave ships documented, from the interior, from the south, from the east, from places the standard account of the slave trade had largely written out of the story entirely. This is not a small revision to history. This is a fundamental one. For 3 centuries, the story told about who Black Americans are, where they came from, what their roots connect back to, was built on the assumption that the answer lived somewhere along the West African coast. And what the DNA from the soil is saying is that the true answer is so much bigger, so much wider, and so much more complex than that. The records kept what was useful for the people keeping them. Ship manifests noted ports of departure, not places of origin. A person could be enslaved in the interior of the continent, walked hundreds of miles to a coastal port, loaded onto a ship, and recorded only as having departed from that port. Their actual homeland, the village, the ethnic group, the specific place on the map that they came from, disappeared the moment the record was written. The paperwork was never designed to preserve that information. It was designed to track cargo, and that is what it did. The DNA does something completely different. It does not track cargo, it tracks mothers. It follows the unbroken biological line from woman to daughter to daughter to daughter across 300 years. And whatever that line points back to, whatever corner of Africa it connects to, that is where the answer actually lives. And the answer, it turns out, is everywhere. Now here is something important to understand about why this discovery matters specifically in the way it happened and why it could only have happened the way it did. Genetic research on African and African American populations has a troubling history. For most of the 20th century, it was conducted by researchers who were not from those communities, for purposes that did not always serve those communities, with interpretations that did not always account for what the communities themselves knew about their own history. The data was extracted, the conclusions were published in journals, and the people whose DNA was being studied often had no say in what questions were being asked or how the answers were being used. The African Burial Ground Project was different from the very beginning because the community insisted it be different. Howard University, black scholars, black researchers, people whose own ancestors might have been among those lying in that soil. When Fatima Jackson runs the ancient DNA from that burial ground, she is not an outside expert applying a methodology to a subject she views from a distance. She is a black woman scientist at a black university studying the DNA of black ancestors for the benefit of black descendants. The question she is asking, not just where did these people come from in the broad sense, but how complex and how geographically wide was the actual origin of black Americans, is a question that serves the community it comes from. It does not simplify the story for outside consumption. It tells the true story, which is harder and bigger and more important than the simplified version. Jackson has also pointed out something extraordinary about the method itself. Because the ancient DNA was recoverable from the soil rather than the bones, it means that sites where physical remains have already been reburied or where remains have degraded beyond use can still potentially yield genetic information. As she put it, it opens up a whole new chapter and says that we don't have to destroy bone in order to get that kind of genomic information. We can actually use the additional information that's all around us. This changes what is scientifically possible going forward. Every burial site where soil was carefully collected, every location where enslaved people were laid in the ground without names and without records, every cemetery that the written history passed over, all of those sites now potentially carry information that we previously assumed was lost forever. This kind of ancient DNA work is already expanding. In Charleston, South Carolina, researchers investigated 36 18th century individuals from the Anson Street African burial ground using genomic methods and found a diversity of ancestral connections across Western Africa, including one individual with genomic links to Fulani peoples of West Africa. Site by site, burial ground by burial ground, the picture is being assembled of a population that the written record reduced to cargo and the DNA is restoring to full, complex, geographically vast humanity. And it is still happening. In Harlem, archaeological fieldwork at a newly discovered African burial ground was completed between June 2024 and September 2025, with human remains and artifacts now in storage and set to begin full analysis in early 2026. Every new site that gets properly studied adds another piece to a picture that 3 centuries of official history never thought to draw. Here is what I want you to understand about why this matters beyond history. When someone today takes a DNA ancestry test hoping to find out whether their family came from Senegal or Ghana or Nigeria or somewhere their records have never named, they are using a chain of knowledge that runs directly through this ground. The scientific methods, the ethical frameworks for community-engaged research, the very understanding that Black American ancestry connects back to a wider African geography than anyone had documented, all of it has roots in what Howard University started in that laboratory when the community refused to let the government turn their ancestors into a construction delay. New Yorkers were shocked when a burial ground believed to contain the remains of more than 15,000 people of African descent was found beneath Lower Manhattan. But the bigger shock, the one still rippling outward, is what that ground is now telling us about who those people were and where they actually came from. The ancestors buried in that ground were not from one place. They were not from one coast. They were not from the narrow geographic story that 3 centuries of written records built and everyone accepted without questioning. They were from all of Africa. Brought together in the holds of ships, buried together in ground the city promptly forgot, and then left to wait for 300 years until someone finally thought to listen to what the soil was still saying. That is not a smaller story than the one we were taught. That is a much, much larger one. And it changes what it means for every Black American today to say, my ancestors came from Africa. Because Africa is not a single point on a map. It is an entire continent. According to the DNA that has survived 3 centuries in the soil of Lower Manhattan, the ancestors came from all of it. The burial ground is a national monument now. The memorial stands. The visitor center is open. But underneath the street that runs beside it, the story is not finished. It is being read for the first time, carefully and slowly, out of material that survived everything the city built on top of it. The community broke open the ground in 1991 because they refused to let a federal building erase their ancestors for the second time. The scientists who answered that community's call have spent 30 years working out what the bones and the soil and the ancient DNA are actually saying. And what it is saying, letter by letter, sequence by sequence, is that the people this city buried and then forgot were not from a footnote in history. They were from an entire continent. They built the city. They were buried in its soil, and the DNA they left behind is finally, after 300 years, telling their real story. If this is the kind of history that changes how you see the world, subscribe right now, because this channel is exactly where we keep digging.